Today we're going to do a quick overview of the Cold War, and much of this is information that you should have learned last year, but it's a good refresher to get us started. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of the basic events and concepts and vocabulary that you'll need to know, and then we'll get into more specifics during class. First of all, what is the Cold War? Well, it's not actually a war, but it's a prolonged period of tension and conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and their subsequent allies between the 1940s and the early 1990s. There's never actually a direct fighting or shooting war between the United States and the USSR, and that's primarily because both are nuclear powers and that an exchange between the two of them could lead to World War III, which could ultimately wipe the human race off the face of the planet because of their nuclear stockpiles. And so we're going to see that both sides are going to get involved in a series of proxy wars where they're fighting each other economically and also militarily, but through other smaller countries that they control and influence. This is like a game of strategy that some liken to either a game of chess or a boxing match. You've got a strategy, you've got to go round to round and make adjustments so that you can survive, but you're never actually going to reveal all of your moves up front. You're always going to have a backup plan if necessary. The underlying policy of the United States during the Cold War is a policy of containment. The idea is that they're going to try to do everything possible to stop the spread of communism and not allow the Soviet Union to influence more territory throughout the world. Note that the policy does not entail completely destroying communism, but just to contain it to its borders and not allowing it to spread any further. And the United States is going to use a variety of military, diplomatic, and economic tools to accomplish this. Some of them will be successful and some of them won't be. The Truman Doctrine, which is unveiled in 1947, is a way to contain communism by injecting money into places that show weakness. And this is primarily going to be in European countries that were weakened and destroyed by World War II. So economic aid is going to be given to countries that are at risk of possibly being taken over or falling into a communist revolution. So the Marshall Plan is the main means of this aid. The Marshall Plan is going to give millions of dollars in aid to especially Eastern European countries, but any European country really that looks like it could be at risk of being taken over by communism. If you take a look at the map of Europe after World War II, you can see that there's a pretty clear dividing line between the democratic capitalist countries and the totalitarian dictatorships influenced by the Soviet Union and operated under communist economic policies. And so all the countries that you see here in green are part of a new alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And NATO is actually going to expand over the years. As you can see some of the years on this map, countries like Turkey and Greece are going to be added to NATO later, and some countries in the Western Hemisphere are going to come to join NATO as well. To counter that alliance, the Soviet Union creates its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact, and so all the countries that you see in the pinkish red color are part of the Warsaw Pact. And so you can see that the dividing line between what we call the free world and the communist world runs right through the center of Germany. This is actually a picture of the division between East and West Berlin. Berlin is the capital city of Germany, and this is called the Brandenburg Gate. And on one side of this gate, you have East Germany, which is controlled and influenced by the Soviet Union, and on the other side of the gate, you have West Berlin, which is influenced and aided by the Western Allies. And you can literally look across this gate and see the difference between communism and capitalism, as will be dramatized in a video that I show you in class of Kennedy making a speech at the wall. Here's an overhead view of the division of Germany. Part of the terms of the peace treaty that ended World War II said that the western half of Germany would be administered and divided and controlled by the allied countries of Britain, France, and the United States, and the Soviet Union would control the eastern half of Germany. But you note that the capital of Berlin is deep within that Soviet zone in eastern Germany, and the city of Berlin, like the rest of the country, is also going to be subdivided. And so you can see that the city of Berlin, the eastern half of it, is going to be controlled by the Soviets and the western half by the other allies. And the dotted line that you see going through the middle is what will become the Berlin Wall, which is actually a concrete structure that's going to physically divide the two sides of the city. one of the problems that arises in 1948 is that Stalin closes off the Allies' access to West Berlin. And so he closes down the supply routes that allow the Allies to get in troops and also to get in food and supplies and other things like that. And so to try to save the city of Berlin from complete communist domination, the British and the United States used planes to basically airdrop supplies into West Berlin and to save the city. And this goes on for a couple of years. West Berlin throughout this conflict is able to maintain a free and democratic status under Allied control. And this is the real first test that the United States is going to see from the Soviet Union. Here's a picture of the airlift taking place and the very grateful West Berlin citizens waving. So by 1961, the Soviet Union realizes that there's a refugee problem between East and West Berlin. And the problem is not so much that they're worried about West Berliners coming into East Berlin. They're more worried about East Berliners leaving and fleeing because they don't want to be under communist control. So this wall is actually meant to keep them in East Berlin and not to escape across. And as you can see, it looks like a prison complex. You've got a concrete wall with barbed wire over it, and then you've also got armed stations with armed guards who could shoot at anyone who tried to get across. This is a later image of the wall, which, as you can see, had been graffitied and sort of turned into a work of art in ways. When the wall finally came down in the late 80s, people actually took pieces of it as souvenirs and kept pieces of it. And I'm going to show you two very important speeches that took place at the wall, one from Kennedy and one from Reagan during class time, and we'll talk a little bit more about the impact and the symbolism of the Berlin Wall. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Asia, because we really have only focused so far on the Cold War in Europe. During this time period, there is a nationalist versus a communist struggle going on in mainland China between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. So Mao's the leader of the communists and Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of the nationalists. And in this prolonged civil war, Mao's forces are being propped up by the Soviet Union, because part of the Soviet Union's goal is to spread communist revolutions around the world. The United States and the Allies, of course, are supporting the nationalists, but unfortunately for them, the nationalists lose the conflict and end up escaping to the island of Taiwan, where they create a separate government. But Mao and the communists take over the mainland part of China and create what's called the People's Republic of China. At that point, the United States only recognizes the Taiwanese government and suspends formal diplomatic ties with the People's Republic. And there's a little diagram to show you where Taiwan's located off the coast of mainland China. As for the Korean War, this is obviously something that the United States is more directly involved in. The Korean War is the first opportunity for the United States to try to contain communism using troops. And so as the Chinese Revolution takes place and starts to spread southward, of course, Korea shares a border with communist China. And so North Korea is going to become influenced by communist China. The point is not to get rid of communism in Korea completely. The point is to stop it from spreading south. And so the United Nations commissions a group of soldiers from all different allied nations to go in and to try to stop the spread of communism southward. So North Korea is going to become communist. South Korea is going to remain democratic and capitalist and supported by the Allies. And you see the line that goes across the middle of the Korean Peninsula is the 38th parallel. And this is actually where the armistice line is drawn at the end of the war, and still today is the division between the communist part of the Korean Peninsula and the democratic part of the Korean Peninsula. This was seen as a victory for containment policy because we did, in fact, do what we set out to do, which was to stop the spread of communism. Now, I suppose you could ask, if you had the opportunity to meet one of them, anybody who lives in North Korea today, and ask them if they think it's a victory. But you probably won't get that opportunity. Taking the focus off of Asia for a minute, let's look at another way in which the Soviet Union was competing with the United States, and this was in terms of technology. During this time period, we see a major push in science and technology on both sides of the conflict, but the Soviet Union sort of strikes first by launching Sputnik in 1957, which is a satellite. And this is basically about a basketball size or a little bit smaller sphere with antennas on it, and it's just got a little chirping mechanism inside of it that can be picked up on radar or radio signal. And this thing is sent up on the tip of a Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile, and it is put into orbit around space, and the thing can be viewed by powerful telescopes and picked up on radio signals. And this is America's kind of aha moment where they realize, hey, we're behind the Soviet Union in terms of science and technology, and there's a major panic that ensues. And people kind of go crazy over Sputnik. They believe that Sputnik somehow can spy on them, that Sputnik is sending out microwaves that are going to brainwash them into becoming communists. One guy even believes that Sputnik remotely opened his garage door. And people freak out about this, and it puts the United States into a panic mode where we feel like we need to push harder on science and technology. And so what ensues from that is what we call now the space race. The United States responds by creating NASA in 1958 and putting tons of money into education for science and technology and math to try to train the next generation to be the future engineers and astronauts. The Soviets upped the ante in 1961 when they send Yuri Gagarin into space, and the United States responds by sending Alan Shepard into space 1 month later. And these guys are just basically orbiting the planet in a space capsule, not landing on anything or exploring anything. It's not until 1969 that the United States is finally able to land men on the moon and return them safely home. And I'm going to play an excerpt of Kennedy's famous moon speech to you, where he makes a pledge to the American people in 1961 that within the decade we will put men on the moon, and we do actually achieve that goal. But much more dangerous than the space race is the arms race. And we know that the arms race began when the United States detonated its first nuclear weapon over Hiroshima. And the Soviet Union actually had spies embedded in the Manhattan Project that allowed them to steal nuclear secrets to construct their own. So by 1949, the Soviets have their own atomic weapon as well. This is going to escalate quickly over the next 10 to 15 years. The United States is going to work on a much more powerful hydrogen bomb, and then of course the Soviet Union is going to develop its own hydrogen bomb, until we get to a point where this graph shows that really at about the peak, the United States gets to somewhere between 31 and 32,000 nuclear warheads at about 1965. And the Soviet Union actually surpasses that by the late 1980s. The Soviet Union has about 40,000. But you could see that during the actual height of the Cold War, the United States had many more nuclear warheads than the Soviet Union. You might ask yourself the question, how many nuclear warheads does a country need? Why stop at 30,000? Why not build 50 or 100,000? The point is that you only need a couple of dozen to destroy the entire planet. So what's the point of having 30,000? The answer is we have to have more than the Soviet Union, and they feel that they need to have more than us. Turning back to the Western Hemisphere, another hot spot of the Cold War is Cuba. We've talked about Cuba plenty in this course, but now we're going to be concerned about Cuba because of new communist influence and Soviet influence there. In 1959, Cuba falls under communist control in a revolution led by Fidel Castro. And Castro, like many other communist dictators, expels an awful lot of people who don't share his political philosophies. 1,500 of those people who are exiled from Cuba find themselves in South Florida, and the United States sees them as good candidates to be trained in a program to help overthrow the communist government of Cuba. And this was actually a plan authorized by the Eisenhower administration on the way out the door, but wasn't implemented until 1961 with the Kennedy administration. And this goes down as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro caught wind of the invasion, and he was able to defeat the incoming insurgents in only 3 days' time, a major embarrassment to the United States and a major setback in containment policy. Because of this, the Soviet Union is going to pledge aid to Cuba by giving them the protection of short and long-range nuclear missiles. And this is going to touch off the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In the next screencast, I'll get into some more detail about the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam.